Whether it's creating a strategy or mobilizing teams to action, the success of a good leader depends on how they lead. Beyond technical skills and training, what qualities make a good leader and help foster a great work environment? Welcome to the School of Public Policy's series on strategies for career and leadership success. Today, we invite you to join the conversation as we speak with Maureen Dodson about emotional intelligence and leadership. Hi, I'm Whitney Sheridan, Director of Communications for the School of Public Policy at Penn State, along with Catherine Baumgardner, our Director of Professional Development and Student Engagement. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Whitney. Great to be here today.
Our guest today is Maureen Dodson, Senior Manager at Baker Tilly. Dr. Dodson has taught numerous undergraduate and graduate courses at Penn State for more than 20 years, including workforce education, facilitating groups and teams for Penn State's World Campus. She spent her career helping organizations advance leadership skills, improve interpersonal communications, and create high-performing teams. Her expertise lies in DISC emotional intelligence, the Myers-Briggs type indicator, team performance, and coaching. Welcome, Maureen. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Whitney. I'm looking forward to it.
We're so excited to have you with us, and we want to encourage our participants to join today's conversation. This is an opportunity for you to ask Maureen your questions about emotional intelligence, so please don't hesitate to use the Q&A or the chat at any time throughout today's discussion. So Maureen, I'd like to start by asking you to kind of break down emotional intelligence and EQ, or emotional quotient, for us. What does all this mean?
Yes, so thanks, Whitney. So, I think most of us recognize the concept of IQ, right? The metric that says how smart we are. And while that used to be thought of as an accurate predictor of success, and not to diminish people who are really smart. But what they found through various types of research is that there is something more important known as emotional intelligence. And that's really the better predictor of success. And emotional intelligence, the good news is that it's flexible. So, IQ is fixed. Emotional intelligence we can work on, and it really consists of four quadrants, if you will. The first two quadrants are about ourselves. So what's our own awareness? So self-awareness, how aware am I of how I come across to other people? And then self-management. How can I manage those emotions? Do I know who or what pushes my buttons? And what do I do about that? And then the other two quadrants are outward. They're about others. So social awareness. Am I tuned in to other people? What might they be feeling? Might they be frustrated, stressed, etc.? And then how do I manage those relationships? So across those four quadrants, we pretty much take care of everybody, ourselves and other people that we interact with.
So, Maureen, I'm curious, how does having that knowledge help you be successful in the workplace?
Well, ironically, the research has shown that the single biggest predictor of success in the workplace is emotional intelligence. So think about, I think we all know really smart people who may not be so great at the people skills. And even in those high achiever categories, the statistics show that 80 to 90% of your success, are neurosurgeons, right? Those people that are super smart, and thankfully so. 80 to 90% of their success is actually based on their emotional intelligence.
So we're talking a lot, though, about our nervous system, our brain chemistry here. There's a scientific aspect to that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely, Whitney. There is a science to it, which is kind of what sold the world on this, because the word emotional intelligence, it sounds like, okay, we're all going to be doing a group hug and singing kumbaya, and I'm not going to be doing that. And the reality is it has to do with how our brain is physically wired, is physically laid out. So when we experience emotions, events, any kind of an event, it enters our brain at the base of, where our spinal cord connects to our our brain. So if you kind of feel that little knob in the back of your neck, that's kind of where the events kind of launch. And there's two physical parts to our brain. The first part is our limbic system, and that's where we feel. Okay, that's where our emotions are. And if you think about, in the early days of mankind, that fight or flee mechanism, that's where that's based. Is there danger? And so, my emotion is going to kick in and I'm going to run away from that danger, or whatever the case may be. So the event travels through the limbic system, where we feel our emotions first. And then it goes to the rational part of our brain, which is located in kind of where our forehead is. Now, this is all nanoseconds, right? This is very quick. But what happens is, what we want to do, whether we realize it or not, we are experiencing every event emotionally first. We do have a say in how we react to that event. And that's where the importance of engaging the rational part of our brain comes into play, right? Someone really, think about, we've all been there. You get that email and you read all kind of things into it. And, well, I'm just going to show them, and you fire the email back. And sometimes we hit send and we go, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done that, right? So, that typing up your response and putting in a Word document instead of in the email, you get it out of your system, and then you maybe let it sit for a while, and you come back to it when the rational part of your brain is more engaged, and you may make, obviously, more rational decisions.
We want to encourage your questions. I want to keep reminding everyone, because this is a great opportunity for you to be involved in today's discussion. So use that Q&A window or the chat at any time throughout the talk.
Maureen, you mentioned that IQ was fixed, but EQ is changeable. So how does having the knowledge you've talked about with the path through the brain and some of the different quadrants that you discussed, how does that help you to change? What are some of the things that you consciously can do to impact your EQ?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Again, and another great question. So, it first starts with awareness, right? So that self-awareness quadrant. Am I aware of who or what pushes my buttons, right? What are my stress points? And those can vary throughout our lives. In the academic world, as we get closer to, big projects being due and having to write papers and studying for tests and juggling all of those things, our stress factors are probably heightened. So if we have an awareness of that, and part of that awareness is paying attention, how do I feel? How do I vent some of these emotions? When I'm upset, do I clench my jaw? Do I feel a rush of blood, from toes to forehead, or vice versa? When I'm nervous, do I jiggle my knee a little bit? So that awareness is the starting point, and it's allowing us to then take that next step and say, okay, how do I manage that? How do I manage that emotion? And we learn as we grow up, right, from being little kids and maybe throwing the temper tantrum. And our parents may have taught us how to manage that, by saying, you're going into timeout. And when you're sitting in timeout, guess what? The rational part of your brain starts to engage. Like, oh, maybe if I want to get out of here, I better settle down, right? And so I think it begins, Catherine, with that awareness of who or what pushes my buttons. What emotions am I feeling? And that's in and of itself a really tough thing to name. Emotions are really complicated. What's the intensity level of that emotion? And then what do I do about that? How can I control that? So those deal with those first two quadrants.
So there's a degree of intention to it. Go ahead, Whitney.
I was going to say these are tips that sound like great help with stress at any point in your career, or as your student, any point when you're in your academic career as well. So these are great for those red flags when you're looking at stress. You might want to stop and take a beat. So when you're looking at those physical symptoms, we've got some great questions coming in that I don't want to ignore, because these are coming in as you're talking. One, I think this is following up with what you're talking about here, Maureen. How do you grow EQ, your emotional quotient? And I think this is kind of what you're talking about here, but maybe speak a little bit more to that if you could.
Yeah, I mean, it's like any other muscle that we try to build. You got to work on it and be deliberate about it. Any new we're talking about behaviors, um, and behaviors are changeable, which is the good news. But that doesn't mean it's easy to change, right? Because those are habits, and so we want to create new habits in order to create those new behaviors. And when I talked about the pathway of the brain, what's happening there, I often use an analogy of a big field of grass. And if I'm walking through that field of grass every day and walking down, walking the same pathway every day, eventually I'm going to tamp down that grass, and that's going to be an easier path for me to walk through. And that's kind of how our neural pathways work, right? So if I want to change those, guess what? I have to go in a different direction. I have to go off that path. And so that's hard. That I have got to be deliberate about that. But the good news is that if I adopt a new behavior, a new habit, um, think about your morning routines, right? You get a shower before you eat, and then suddenly you want to change that. And that might feel a little wonky at first, a little unnatural. But the more you do it, and research shows that at least the easier habits take a minimum of 21 days to change. So what you're trying to do is create that new pathway. And it's going to be hard because now I'm walking through the high grass again. And there's a little more resistance, right? And so, but if I continue on that new pathway, the old pathway will grow up. The weeds and the grass will grow, and that won't be the path of least resistance anymore. So it's being very deliberate, just like we are with any kind of habit that we want to change. We want to start to exercise. And so guess what? You start the routine, right? And you try to do it every day. And some days you don't. But that doesn't mean that you quit. That means that you just keep at it. You keep doing it.
And we had another question here. If I wanted to set a goal to improve my EQ, what are some concrete steps that I could take to break that goal into achievable steps? Which that's what you were just speaking about. So that's great. We have a couple here about mindfulness. One was from Jody Harris that said, it sounds like mindfulness is closely connected to EQ. And then another one that says, is mindfulness helpful in learning to recognize our buttons and when they have been triggered? So two about mindfulness, if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yes, and the answer is absolutely. There is very much a connection. That's a way to be more aware of your own emotions, what's going on, and focusing, and calming yourself, right? So, I think it's great that in this day and age, that more people are aware of those kinds of tools. Think about the app on your phone, right? I see commercials all the time for Headspace, and people that just even if it's for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, you can do some mindfulness activities, because that is getting in touch with what am I feeling, how do I stay centered, what's my game plan going to be if I go off track a little bit, go off the beaten path, if you will. And so absolutely mindfulness is a huge a huge help to creating more better emotional intelligence.
One thing I wanted to ask you, we're talking about people who are interested in change. What about those who might be averse to change? I'm thinking of those who might think, I don't need to change. I'm fine just the way I am. I've got this high IQ. I'm great with everything the way it is. What do you say to those people?
Yeah, I think we all know that that change has to come from within. And you raise a good point, right? I'll share a story from one of my favorite books that I think illustrates this pretty well. there's a great book, and unfortunately, the older I get, the less people know about this book. But it's called The Last Lecture by Randy Pausch, and it was a bestseller. I think it came out in 2006, somewhere along those lines. But Randy Pausch was a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. He was in the computer science department, and unfortunately was diagnosed at a very young age with pancreatic cancer and had to leave the university. And one of the traditions with the university was that when you retired, you gave a last lecture. And so because Randy was leaving, he gave a last lecture. It's still on YouTube. I think if you want to see it, it's really phenomenal. But it subsequently led him to write a book called by the same name. And the book just has all kinds of little life's lessons that he learned along the way. And one of the stories that he tells is that, he said, look, I was a really smart kid, and I always got by in life because I was really smart. And he said, so I'm at Brown University. I'm getting my PhD in computer science, and I'm in my mid 20s, and the world is my oyster. I'm gonna my trajectory is just off the chart. And he said he was working. He was a grad assistant for the head of the department at the time, a guy by the name of Andy Van Dam. And he said we were walking across campus, and he admitted, he said, I never thought about how I came across to people, because it had never been an issue, at least in my own mind. And he said, as we're walking across campus, Andy puts his arm around my shoulder and it says, Randy, it's a shame that people perceive you as being so arrogant, because it's going to limit what you're going to be able to do in life. And he said, I felt like I got punched in the gut for the first time in my life. I'm arrogant. And he said, when it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because when I reflected on it, I'm teaching kids how to program computers, and they would come to me in the lab and say, I'm having trouble with X. And he said, when I thought about it, my reaction was kind of condescending. Really, you don't understand? Oh, that's easy. And so he said that was a critical moment in his point in his life at that point. And he dubbed Andy Van Dam his Dutch uncle. And he said everybody needs a Dutch uncle, and the Dutch uncle is known to be that person who can tell you things that you might not want to hear, but you need to hear them, and so you're open to that. So find that Dutch uncle, listen to the feedback. And again, research bears it out. And I think we all can relate to maybe really smart people, or people who are experts at what they do, but they're just a train wreck. Nobody wants to work with them. Nobody wants to collaborate with them because it just takes so much energy. So I would challenge people to look in the mirror. Are you that person?
So it's that self-awareness that you're talking about, which was one of those components. But also what I'm hearing is finding that person that you really trust too, to be able to solicit that feedback, to find that mirror, that other mirror that can be that person for you as well, and to get that tough criticism as well. Maybe if you don't have that person, develop those friendships too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And we did get someone who wanted to thank you for the reminder, since they hadn't watched Randy Pausch's last lecture in quite a while. So thank you for that.
Great.
I want to remind everyone we've gotten some great questions so far, but we are still open for many more, because this is your discussion with Maureen Dodson. She's here to talk about emotional intelligence and leadership. So send your questions to us via the Q&A window or the chat at any point during the discussion.
Maureen, I'm intrigued with the self-awareness piece, because it requires a lot of self-reflection. And so many times in leadership roles or aspiring to leadership roles, you're often in that position because you've accomplished a lot. And that self-reflection, sometimes we believe our own, believe our own story, and hearing someone perceiving you differently, as Randy Pausch did, can be very, very humbling. I guess I'm curious about, how do we prepare ourselves to begin to do that? And you mentioned looking for someone to be that mirror for you, but is there a role that are there other things you can do to really sort of take a look at how you're impacting people around you? Is journaling, for example, something that's you find helpful?
Yeah, and journaling is right up there with mindfulness, right? Of being reflective, how in journaling, how are you feeling in certain situations, so you can get a sense of what those triggers are. What's that perfect storm that may be brewing that might push you over the edge? Because on a regular day, maybe some of those things wouldn't bother you.
Mm.
But when maybe you like to exercise and you watch your caffeine intake and you need to get your rest, right? And so if any, it's all like almost like a three-legged stool. If any of those are off kilter, that can become, the sign, like, oh, I didn't get enough sleep last night. So am I complicating that by pounding down the caffeine?
Mhm.
And then I didn't get to work out yet, and so my day is off balance, and so that's that perfect storm. So you need to be on kind of high alert on those days. I also think there are subtle things that we can do when we're engaging with other people. If somebody has an idea and you respond to their idea, do they suddenly shut down? So it may not be what you said or what you intended, but maybe the perception is that you thought it was a dumb idea.
Mm.
And so reading other people's body language, facial expressions, which is hard to do, and you may not be accurate, but that's the opportunity to say, I'm sorry, I think I cut you off. Um, could you please proceed with your idea? Or I'm sorry, I think I gave you the wrong impression. A lot of I statements, not
Mhm.
like you shut down or I think you're mad, because that's just going to add fuel to the fire, so to speak. But I think just being aware, and that's that social awareness. That's where we're
Mm.
dabbling into those last two quadrants. Am I aware of other people and what they may be feeling?
Mm. And I wanted to point out, we did get a comment that said, um, talked about phrasing. And when you were talking about that story about Randy Pausch, that said Andy Van Dam was aware enough to phrase it as people perceive you as arrogant versus why are you so arrogant? So it's very important about that word choice, which is very constructive.
Yeah, absolutely. Good observation.
Mhm. So I wanted to go to a couple questions. Is there a dimension of EQ that should be strengthened before others are addressed? Is there one that should come first before others?
So I think they all are related. Eventually. Um, my personal opinion, for what it's worth, is I think self awareness is the most critical one. If we know people who aren't self aware, if I say, oh, I'm a great listener, I'm a really good listener, my disc style says I'm a great listener, and everybody else is going, you never shut up, and I don't know that about myself, then, that's a downside. So I would say self awareness. The hardest, I think, is the self management. What do
Mm,
I do about it? And so I think those inward ones, because the other factor here is that, it's probably good news that, we all have an inner voice in our brain, and our inner voice influences those pathways, it influences our reactions. Um, and thankfully, we're the only ones that can hear that inner voice, right?
mm,
Um, so paying attention to that and sometimes reframing the inner voice, it's the proverbial, are you a glass half full or half empty person? So something goes wrong and is your first reaction going, oh, this is going to be a mess, right? Instead of saying, all right, I've been through something like this before and it ends up being fine, so just stay calm, it'll be okay. So rewiring your self-talk can really impact and change your behaviors.
mm,
And journaling, just to add on to that, that's where journaling can be helpful. Like, what what's the voice in your head saying, and write it down in your journal, and then look for those patterns.
Mhm. We had a couple questions that I wanted to touch on that might help clarify some things for some folks. One is asking about documenting your emotional intelligence on your CV or resume, and then a question about, or is this more about the interview versus the document? So maybe we should talk about this, because what we're discussing is more about those interpersonal skills, correct?
Yeah, they really are. And I'm not sure why you couldn't do both.
Mm,
I think the danger might be you might want to vet the document with
mm,
somebody who knows you well. You're Andy Van Dam, to say, look, I think I'm really good at X, and I've put interpersonal communications as one of my strengths. Do you see me that way? So I think, just to kind of fact check it, because again, our own perceptions might not match what other people say. But I think absolutely in the interview, I think we've all been there. um, and as interviewers, we often look, you're getting Randy Pausch goes on to tell a story about all of the he was the head of a master's degree program in basically building video games, like entertainment, whatever. Um, and it was a program that accepted like 36 students a year. That was it. And he said it was very competitive. And he said what he realized was every one of the kids who applied had the technical skills. They were geniuses. They were like building computers when they were 8 years old in their garages. But he said what I looked for was really the people skills.
mhm,
He told a story about one of the files that he was moving around. Um, a card fell out of the file, and when he picked it up, it was a thank you note to the secretary of their department, from a candidate who was thanking the secretary for arranging the campus tour. And Randy said, I didn't even know this person wrote it. The secretary just kind of stuck it in the file, didn't know what to do with it. He said that person was immediately accepted into the program
mm,
because they got it. They got the people side of the equation. So I
mm,
think it's, how are you coming across in those interviews? There's answers to the questions,
mm,
but then I think there's just more about, are you talking to the secretary, the administrative assistant in the outer office before you go into the interview?
mhm.
I've had people who do interviews say, I listen for that. Like, did they acknowledge them at all? And if they didn't, I don't want them. And we don't think about those little things.
Mhm. So it's like and a lot of this, what we're talking about, relates to those soft skills that
Hmm.
we often list on our resumes in addition to those technical skills, correct?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Mhm,
But I think what seals the deal is demonstrating those. You can say you have them, but are you
mhm,
walking the talk?
mhm,
Speaking of those soft skills, Maureen, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. And, thinking of some of our questions, asking for some specificity around steps and these things. What if, how would you use your emotional intelligence if you're going into a meeting and you know there's someone in that meeting that's difficult to work with or pushes your buttons? How might you prepare yourself for that engagement?
Yeah, and I will admit I've been there. I think we all are there, right?
Yeah.
I think it's it begins with that self-awareness. You know who's going to be in that meeting. Maybe it's a standing meeting. And I think it's rerouting that neural pathway. Thinking about your self-talk. So are you saying, this is going to be, here we go again. This is going to be great. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So changing your self-talk, thinking about, the physical aspects to when you're in that meeting, or even before you're going in, what physically is going on? Are you feeling the stress? Are you starting to tense up? And so what can you do to maybe a walk around the hallway before you go into the meeting, try to get that energy out. It seems silly, but I think we've all heard of, you might have a I'll use my Western Pennsylvania roots. I want to call it a gum band, but I think it's a rubber band for most people. But, putting that around your wrist, and maybe just kind of flicking yourself when you're getting that, you're getting that sensation to kind of snap you back into that. I think it's being prepared. I think it's if you feel yourself starting to cross that line, what's your intervention going to be? And maybe it's something like, you know what, we've talked a lot about a lot of things here, and so let me process this. And I don't want to make a snap decision right now. Or you might be perfectly candid and say, I don't want to say something that I might regret. So let me kind of calm down here and circle back to you. And I think that demonstrates that great self-awareness also.
We do have a comment from Erica Husser. I find that ego and hierarchy are problematic, but they are surmountable if you have courage to simply be human in conversation. And that's a great point, playing on everything that we're talking about right now. So yeah, I want to point out that we are open in the Q&A or the chat at any point if you want to send us your questions that way. Maureen, I wanted to revisit the IQ and EQ. We mentioned this a little bit before. If someone has a really high IQ and great test scores, they might think, do I really need to worry about EQ? And when we're talking about leadership, specifically those in decision-making positions, or maybe people in positions of supervision or influence, they might rise through the ranks because of that technical expertise. But it really sounds like that emotional intelligence is the key to really good leadership. Can you talk about that part about it, the leadership and the emotional intelligence part about it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you raise an excellent point. That positional power, working for somebody who, for lack of a better description, may be a jerk, can be stressful. And we may feel like we really don't have a choice. And I think, as we go through our careers, I've got great leaders that I've worked for and been fortunate enough to work for, and I've got my share of jerks that I worked for. So I think part of that is, we can try to influence that person's behavior as best we can, but I think that bumps into those social awareness quadrants, and then managing that relationship. And so sometimes you do what you need to do. And I think you have to gauge whether you approach them or not. Um, and that person may get away with that for a while, but I've also got plenty of stories in those scenarios where, when there's a consequence to them, that's when they sit up and take notice. And my personal take on this is, that the people side is a fuzzier science. It's harder to measure things on the people side. I can measure, and I'll give you my world as an example. So I currently work for an accounting and consulting firm, and accounting is for the most part black and white, right? And so a number of years ago, I got a call from one of the managing partners who wanted to talk to me about a partner who was about 18 months from retirement, who was kind of a jerk. The guy who called me, those were his words. And so we had a conversation, and I said, so, he's 18 months from retirement. Why now? And or why didn't you do anything before? And the response was, well, see, that's the problem. He generates X amount of revenue for our firm. And because I'm kind of old enough to to not worry about job security as much anymore, I kind of came back with well, then by all means, let him be a jerk. And the guy kind of, and I said, so why now? What's the pain point? And the pain point was that a bunch of people who worked for this guy were starting to leave. A lot of high potential people that they had big plans for within the firm started to go, it was a revolving door. And so there is always a metric there. Sometimes you have to dig for it. But when you can say, look, 15 people left under you this year, and every other group has maybe 2 or 3, well, that now we have a metric. The sad footnote to the story was they decided that they would put up with him for another 18 months. And one of the pushbacks that I had for that managing partner who expressed the dollar value, the revenue value of this gentleman, I said, how do you know that those 15 people that left couldn't have generated at least as much, if not more, in their lifetime career with the firm? So I think there are ways. I think I think the good news is that it's more on the map today. That it can't be just about, you know, here's where you got to for us. It's also how you got there and how you treated people along the way, and they're being held more accountable, and rightly so. So I think if that becomes a pain point, like, hey, I'm going to lose my job unless I figure this out, then there's a consequence potentially for them. But it is tough, when you're in the pecking order on a low rung. But that doesn't give you license to do the same thing. So if nothing else, it's maybe taking that and saying, what do I want people saying about me someday around the dinner table? We all talk about work at dinner, right? And so how do I want people to be talking about me around their dinner tables or with their loved ones? Do I want to be known as the jerk?
Oh, that's a great point.
Mm, excellent point. You're talking a lot about culture and in some ways kind of striking a balance. And what you described, what happened with the partner, was pretty clearly that the culture was going to value financial contribution over cultural contribution. And how, I guess, how have you seen organizations start to balance that expectation?
Yeah, I think uh, the last year and a half, certainly the pandemic kind of flipped everything. But I think when you think about other aspects to the workplace, that you think about the Black Lives Matter movement, and that created, I know in our organization, which already had initiatives um, for diversity and inclusion, but to push it more out front.
Mhm.
And I think the good news for those of you going into the workforce, I mean, if you look at numbers generationally, um, population wise, there's plenty of the bulk of the population right now in the workplace are baby boomers in terms of their presence. They're
Mhm.
going to be retiring and they're going to be going away. Um, and there aren't enough of the next generation to replace them. It's plain and simple. So what that means is that the people who are applying for jobs, in the current college graduates, that cohort, you're kind of in the driver's seat. And a lot of times, from a recruiting standpoint, not that that's why people do it, but they're starting to pay closer attention. People in interviews, candidates are now saying, what's your diversity and inclusion program look like? Do you have, what are my chances for advancement? I'm a female, and I want to have a family, and I want to have a career. And that was something in my day, wow, you never broached that subject, right? You didn't even say when your kid was sick, you figured
Mm-mm.
out how to get them taken care of.
You barely
Now
even told them you had children.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
I remember my mom, God love her, she's 89. Um, she was a secretary out of high school, and when she got engaged, she lost her job because they said you're gonna get pregnant as soon as you get married.
Mm.
Thankfully, we've come a long way with that stuff. So I think that this next generation, their expectations, and rightly so, are around culture and, work-life balance. I remember one of the partners in our firm saying that they used to go to orientation and say, you know what, if you work 80 hours a week, for a good 10 years, you can be a partner like me. And they started to get the response of, why would I want to do that? You know? This guy just like was blown. He's like, what do you mean you wouldn't want to be? And they're like, wow, that doesn't sound like fun. So they're trying to figure that out. So I think the momentum is moving in the right direction to find that balance, not only between task, but that people side.
I wanted to ask you about that, but first, I want to remind everyone that we're open for questions because we still have time with Maureen Dodson to answer your questions about emotional intelligence and leadership. But I wanted to address that work-life balance because we all know workaholics, or we've been workaholics, whether we're currently in the workplace or maybe we're really working hard at our schoolwork. But you know, maybe we're just starting out in our career and we feel pressured to work long hours, or there are a lot of people who just really are passionate about their jobs. How can understanding your emotional intelligence or EQ help prevent that workaholism? How does that factor into it?
And it's hard. I mean, I will always preach that technology is a blessing and a curse. When I entered the workforce, it was a 9 to 5 job. There was no such thing as email. There were no cell phones. There was one computer that the whole department shared. I'm really showing my age, but it wasn't all that long ago. So the good news is, I can check my email on my phone and send a quick response when I'm teaching and I'm on a break, and so I don't, I'm not without communication for a whole day. Um, so that's the good side of it. The bad side is that where are the boundaries, and I think a lot of people have seen this in the pandemic. I've always had the luxury of really working virtually anyway when I'm not teaching, and so that wasn't as big of a deal for me. But even at this point in my life, after dinner, everything's still fired up, and I'll go and check an email, and my husband will say, now what are you doing? Now what are you doing? And I'm like, well, I'm not watching you fall asleep in the chair. What's the difference? But no, but seriously, it's where do I find, what are those boundaries? It is hard. And because of your point, Whitney, I want to work really hard. I want to, I want to do my best. That's a value that you have, and you want that ingrained. But I think you have to think about at what cost. I was just coaching a young professional in one of my client organizations, and we had our last coaching session yesterday after 9 months, and she's really come a long way. And a lot of it was related to stress and how she channeled that stress. And how I said, what are your goals? And she said, well, I want to be a partner someday, but I'm also getting married next year, and I know I want to start a family. And so I said, okay, so that all of that stress is never going to go away, so you got to think about, and she talked about deliberately disconnecting from work. And I said, how does that make you feel? And she said, really good, and recharged and refreshed. And so getting her to kind of flip, you could work 16 hours every day, but you're going to be stressed because your fiance is upset that you're not doing anything on the weekend and blah blah blah, as opposed to taking that time, scheduling that time for yourself, and then you go back and you're operating on all cylinders because you've had time to disconnect and recharge. And again, I really think this next generation of workers is going to force companies to do that. And I think the pandemic in a weird way helped that we don't have to be in the office for 12 hours a day to be productive. So, it'll be interesting to see how that changes, how the workforce and how those boundaries, get set. And so I think be protective of those and be mindful of your own boundaries.
Maureen, you've talked about self-awareness being one of the first steps to moving toward emotional intelligence. Are there other tools that you often use or have experience with that help people to gain that deeper self-awareness? So not only finding a Dutch uncle, journaling, but are there some other things out there? Is emotional intelligence just really kind of an umbrella uh, approach that you plug other pieces of insight into?
Yeah, I think those things are all so connected. I mean, just from an assessment standpoint, there's a company called Talent Smart. They've done a lot. They have an assessment. It's kind of the go-to assessment. I think it's 49.95 online, which seems like a kind of a steep price, but it gives you access to videos and tips and strategies, and it also allows you to retake the assessment in 6 months, so you see if you made any progress. So that, it's just a quick, simple assessment tool that gives you scores in each one of those quadrants, so you can see, relatively speaking, what's my highest, what's my lowest. Catherine, I know you're a big fan of DISC and Myers-Briggs, and I think those things, human beings are really complex, so it's not just one thing that influences us. But I think to recognize what those other things bring to the table about your own self-awareness, and are you more inclined to speak up or not, and maybe what could you do to get better, to get more confident at those things. The Talent Smart folks, there are two people who own that company. I think Whitney's, if she hasn't already, is going to share these
I do.
these references. But they've written books, Emotional Intelligence
Oh,
Quick Book, Emotional Intelligence 2.0. And they have not only access to the assessment online, so sometimes if you buy the book, you can get a code and go online and take the assessment. So that's a nice feature. But more importantly, they've got tips and strategies for how do you get better at each one of those quadrants, if that's what you're inclined to do. So, Catherine, I'm not sure if that fully answered your question or not.
Well, I think what it's highlighting is, in a world where you may not control everything, what you can do is control yourself and how you react to that world. And so the tools that you put together, the self-awareness that you engage in, the way that you then decide to self-manage and interact and engage with others, really does a couple of things. It sets an example for others, but it also gives you a sense of peace of mind as you're engaging in the world around you. And maybe, perhaps, whether you're a leader or not, having an influence.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's that referent power, right?
Mhm.
I always like to kind of divide that positional power and referent power. Do people follow you because they have to? My boss says I have to work. Or do people follow you because they want to? And I
mhm.
think finding those people who can become valuable mentors, they may start off in positional power, but they may end up being somebody who you just, they have such wisdom and such sage advice. And if you had a choice, you would certainly follow them, from a career standpoint, or try to work for them, or whatever. So I think we do have some choices, and maybe we may have more control than we think we do.
Mhm.
I want to take this question because I think this is one that would help so many of us to understand. How can your EQ have a balance when it comes to social media?
Yeah, and so you're talking to someone who has two sons, 30, soon to be
Mhm.
32 and 28, um, who are on Twitter all the time, a husband who I can't believe is on Twitter. um, I am totally a social media uh, um, moron, might be the correct terminology. I don't engage in any of that. And in all honesty, it's deliberate because of the time. I just think, oh my God, you spend so much time on that. Having said that, it is, it's not going away anytime soon. So I think, again, that self-awareness of how much time are you spending on various aspects of social media. And I know it goes beyond Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. But, maybe like like we have logs on our phone, right? How much time did you spend on that? And do you do that, oh my goodness, like kind of aspect to it? And secondly, I think where the emotional intelligence part comes in, are there times when you're stressed, when you're engaging, when you're reading something on Facebook, um, when you're tweeting something or responding to a tweet or seeing, and you even seen, news coverage of Twitter, what somebody said on Twitter. So I think the awareness becomes, how much time am I spending on it? Is it stressing me out? And what are the patterns to those? Is it the same person that I'm following or the same person that comments on me? And so maybe you disconnect from that person because that's that toxic environment. And you do have a choice in that in Twitter and Facebook, right? Unlike saying, I'm just going to disconnect from my boss. Probably not a good idea, but so that's my very rudimentary, not being in that fray. Um, uh, those are just my personal opinions about what you can do in those in that world.
I wanted to ask you about performance reviews. We've mentioned that, not everybody's going to be in that leadership or that supervisory position right away, or maybe not want to be a supervisor, or be in that position of influence. But it's important for those getting ready to graduate to understand how the skills that we're discussing factor into their work. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, performance reviews, it's interesting. I think there's been they used to be an annual event.
Mhm.
They are now, and again, I think it's driven by generation. How am I doing? How am I doing? We now have like immediate feedback. Like we have a system that, you just give somebody immediate feedback on what they did well, what they need to work on. So they can, they're not waiting a year from now and saying, why didn't you tell me that back in, uh, last May? Here we are in March, and now I'm supposed to like fix that in 2 months. So, I think the immediacy of that, and whether we like it or not, people's perceptions of us are our reality. Now,
Mm.
performance reviews should be grounded in facts, right? And so the fact may be, when we were in the staff meeting, and you said, well, you never have a good idea. Maureen shut down at that point. So let's talk about that. And, so there's facts in those conversations. And, it's, whether we like it or not, that can hinder our trajectory often in an organization. Um, so it is an important part. I think it's the Andy Van Dam. Maybe if ahead of time you can get your friends, people that you listen to. You might not like it at first. Maybe it's a significant other or a family member or just a best friend your whole life who gets away with saying, what, that was bad. You messed up. Um, getting that real feedback, and soliciting that, just saying, look, what do you think my strengths are? I always like to start with the good things. What do you think will serve me well when I go into the workplace, and what do you think I need to work on? If you've done group projects, Catherine and I are familiar with those in the classes that we teach. But think about, do you evaluate each other? Do you give feedback to each other? And how do you feel, when you don't give feedback? That's not part of the scenario. How do you feel when somebody doesn't pull their weight?
Mm.
You know, is that fair? And so think about, you don't want to be that person, right? But I think performance reviews are never going to go away. I think if anything, they're going to be more frequent, and maybe that's not a bad thing, because maybe things don't build up over time. But you know, it how people perceive you may limit you. And just one other really quick real world story. I do 360 assessments a lot, And one of the 360 assessments that I use is the Emotional and Social Competency Inventory by Richard Boyatzis, who was one of the pioneers with Dan Goleman of this emotional intelligence and the metrics of it. And I had a guy who very high up in his organization, and I was interpreting the results and helping him prioritize and analyze. And there was one item, and I said, you might want to take a look at this one item with one rater group. And I said, that might be something you want to focus on and work on. And his response was, what if I don't want to? And I almost said, you really said that? Like, you really said that out loud? So he's going to be a tough nut to crack. And until there are consequences to him, which I'm not sure why he doesn't realize that one of the reasons they're doing a 360 is because he's kind of a bonehead like that. That's why they're saying, look, you need to hear this, you need to see this. So I think until there are potential consequences, like somebody above him saying, look, you don't straighten out, you're not going to make partner, or whatever that carrot that he's trying to strive for. If that gets removed, then all of a sudden they get very deliberate about that. So whether you're high in the organization or entry level, it is going to it's going to impact how you achieve your own goals within an organization, whether you achieve the level that you really want to get at.
I want to ask, we're just about out of time, but Maureen, I wanted to ask your final thoughts on leadership. And we do have a quick comment here. I love the Babe Ruth poster in the back. I do want to ask your final thoughts or words of advice on leadership and emotional intelligence, because what we've been talking about is so important, especially as our students are getting ready to graduate very soon here.
Yeah, exciting times. And thank you. My husband is the decorator in our house, so I have absolutely no say in what goes up on the office walls or anywhere else in the house. So I will pass that along to him. He's an I from a disc perspective. He will absolutely love that. So thank you for that. No, I think just in summary, I have been in the workplace long enough to see how people perceive leaders. And, I think emotional intelligence is a really critical aspect of leadership. Being self-aware, being able to manage that, and then being socially aware, like tuned into other people as well. So, do you know when someone's having a bad day? Do you know when somebody's off their game? And particularly the higher up you go in the organization, the more important it is. To get the most out of people who work for you, you need to be tuned in. So if they're having a bad day, not that you have to be their psychologist or solve their problems, but just have that awareness and that empathy. And empathy is really a key ingredient to emotional intelligence. To at least say to them, is everything okay? You seem a little off kilter today. Do you want to talk about it? Or if those problems are deeper, I think almost every organization has an employee assistance program. And I think the good news of, again, this next generation is talking about mental health and getting help, and not that it's no longer something in the shadows, right? But having an awareness of other people and what might be going on with them, and having some empathy around that. And sometimes that can influence your own perceptions, your own self-management, like, what's going on maybe in their world that you may not be aware of. Can I tell one quick Stephen Covey story?
Of course.
So Stephen Covey talks about this concept of empathy, and he tells a story in his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People seminal bestseller. He said, he was on a subway in New York one time, and the subway doors open up, and these like 5 kids come running on the subway, and their father kind of comes behind them. And he said the kids are little and they're just running all over the subway, and it's rush hour, and they're banging into people. And Stephen Covey said, I'm just getting more irritated the more I'm sitting there, and we're going a couple stops, and they're banging into people, and the dad is just kind of standing there not doing anything. And so he said, I'm thinking to myself, why doesn't the dad do something with these kids? So he said, finally, he goes up to the dad and he says, hey, I just wanted to tell you, your kids are running around and they're banging into people, and don't you think you should say something? And the dad looked at him and said, oh yeah, I guess you're right. I'm really sorry. We just came from the hospital, and my wife, their mother, she just died, and I have no idea what I'm going to do next. Stephen Covey said, I felt like such a jerk, right? So you don't know what other people might be dealing with, and not that you have to know their stories or that they have to share, and you want to, be respectful of their boundaries. But, paying attention if somebody is off their game, particularly as a leader, that's your job. That's your job, to create an environment where everybody feels safe and where they feel they can flourish and do their best.
Sounds like a lot of empathy is a very key, and not just in a leadership position, but being a part of the team is key as well.
Absolutely.
Well, we want to thank everyone who's been a part of today's conversation for all of your great questions. And thanks to our special guest, Maureen Dodson. We hope you'll join us on Wednesday, April 21st at 11:30, when we talk about taking action and making an impact when you aren't in a position of formal influence. You can watch past events from this and our other series from the School of Public Policy on our YouTube channel. You'll find links, event information about our program at publicpolicy.psu.edu. Thanks so much for watching today. I'm Whitney Sheridan with Catherine Baumgardner. For all of us with the School of Public Policy, thank you, and we hope to see you next month. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.